So we're going to take a look inside the alternator cover. And the first electrical component that I want to draw your attention to is the one in the middle. So it's that funny looking component with all the electrical wire windings. Okay, so it's just this unit. It's held in place with 3 bolts here. And it's just this unit here. So this is the stator. And the stator is responsible for recharging the motorcycle's battery. So the way it works is that this stator, when the alternator cover is installed on the engine, the stator actually fits in here in the middle of the rotor. Okay, and when the engine is running, the piston is driving this crankshaft which runs through the middle of the motorcycle engine, and the rotor is on the end of the crankshaft. So as a result, when the engine is running, the rotor is turning. Okay, that is significant because the rotor itself is kind of composed, I suppose, of 2 components. On the outside, there's just this metal surface. It's just almost perfectly smooth the whole way around on the outside. But on the inside, it has a magnet. So let me demonstrate it. If I just take this piece of, or this bolt, you can see that it just sticks to the inside of the rotor. And the reason it sticks to the inside of the rotor is because it's a permanent magnet. No matter where I stick it, it's gonna stick. Okay, so the whole of this inside is a perfectly smooth permanent magnet. And that when the rotor is turning, it acts on the copper wire windings in the stator to induce an alternating current which runs out through the yellow wires that come out through the top of the alternator cover, or the side of the alternator cover, and they lead on to the battery to charge it. So I'm not going to explain it any more than that really. I have a separate video on which explains in detail how a motorcycle charging system works, so please take a look at that. I'll explain it in full detail. You'll get a complete breakdown of how the stator works and how the charging system works. But for the purposes of this video, motorcycle engine, I just needed you to understand that the rotor and the stator, they're responsible for recharging the motorcycle battery. Now, the second component that I want to draw your attention to inside the stator, or inside the alternator cover, is this component here, and it's called a pickup coil. And the pickup coil at a high level is essentially responsible, or its job is to tell the engine or the spark plugs when to fire. Okay, so how does it do that? Well, we're going to go back to the rotor first of all, and we're going to notice that on the outside surface of the rotor, it is perfectly smooth. If I can just get it to turn. Apart from here. So here we can see there is a metal protrusion, and it's just a piece of metal. It's not magnetic or anything like that. It's just a metal protrusion on the otherwise perfectly smooth surface of the rotor. Okay, so if you look the whole way around, there is no other protrusions. It's just there. Okay, and what that protrusion does when this alternator cover again is installed on the engine, it acts on this little pickup coil. Every time it rotates, goes through 360 degrees, that little nodule passes by this pickup coil once every 360 degrees. And if I just take this bolt again and just put it near this little, what looks like a little piece of metal protruding from the pickup coil, I will actually notice, turn it upside down. Turning it upside down, you'll see that the bolt stays in place, and that's because it itself is a magnet. Okay, so sticking it anywhere else, it's not magnetic, but here it is actually a little permanent magnet. So next up, with the alternator cover off, I want to take a look at some other components. You can hopefully you can see a little bit clearer. So we have our markings on the rotor, and these markings are there to tell us about the timings for the firing of the spark plug, and also to tell us which position the piston is at. So at this point here, when it's at marking here is at the very top center, it's the marking for the T, and again that T indicates that it should indicate that the piston is at top dead center. And as you can see at this point here, the piston is standing straight up in the air. This is as high as the piston gets in the engine. And if I keep rotating it on, you'll see that the piston just goes down from here. It goes down, reaches its lowest point, and then it starts coming back up again. Right, so we see it's coming here. Right in the middle here we have two line markings. Okay, so they're just a sort of a heads up that the main markings are coming. So at this point here, let's go back a little bit. At this point there's a line with an F beside it, is at the top center of the rotor turn. And again, that F, if you will remember, as I spoke earlier in the video, that F indicates the timing at which the spark plug will fire, or at which we will see a spark come from the spark plug. And then not long after it, we see the T mark. And again, the reason being that the spark plug will usually ignite, or the spark will be set off usually just before the piston reaches top dead center. Okay, and then also just before the F marking, which is here, before the F we have that little raised metal piece on the top of the rotor, which again acts on the pickup coil to send that signal to tell the spark plug to fire. So we can read it very clearly, the rotor. As it's turning around, we have that raised protrusion, metal protrusion on the rotor, which sends a signal to tell the spark plug to fire. So it takes a very short period for that signal to transfer through the electrical system, and then for that spark to fire on the spark plug at the marking for the F, and that occurs just before, again, the T marking, which is just before the piston reaches top dead center. This is the gear coming from the starter motor, right? So when we're starting the motorcycle for the first time using the key, the starter motor acts on this gear, which then acts on this larger gear which is behind the rotor, and it spins it. This gear goes counterclockwise when the starter motor is turning this gear here clockwise. And we can actually just slip out this gear, this little gear unit. It's on a little shaft. It's only a small little shaft. So it's a 2-gear unit. We have a large gear at the back and a smaller gear at the front. And it's just easy to slot it in or out. It's just simple. Okay, so we'll just be careful with this component. Okay, because you need to ensure that you insert it the right way. If you insert it the wrong way, it's not going to act on it's not going to start your engine. And we also need to be careful because there is some washers on either end of this component, and we need to make sure that those washers stay in place. And then lastly, I suppose I want to draw your attention through around the mating surface where the stator or the alternator cover meets the crankcase. So you will notice that there is a gasket between the alternator cover and the crankcase, and we also have some locating dowels. We have one here, and we also have one that goes in here, and that's the corresponding dowel is actually still stuck in the cover. So make sure you don't lose your dowels. You can possibly leave your dowel in, you can possibly pull it out as well. That one I'm just going to leave in. It seems like it's fairly secure, but you want to make sure that sometimes they can come out and just they're not stuck in either the cover or the crankcase, and then they just fall on the ground and they can get lost. So make sure you don't lose that. With the alternator cover removed, we can also see a little bit clearer this spacing here. Okay, so it has a little black rubber oil seal, and this is where the neutral switch fits in. Okay, so the neutral switch did not come with this particular engine, but it's just a little electrical component that fits in here, and it's secured with 2 bolts there and there, and from it comes a little lead which leads up to the electrical system, and its job is to essentially detect when the engine is in neutral. And what you'll probably notice here is that up at the top, or in the middle, there is a little hole, but just up above that there is a little black dot, but that's another little hole. And when that little hole is in that position, it indicates that the engine is in neutral, so it's not in gear. Okay, and we can turn actually the sprocket, so the output sprocket. When we run this, turn this output sprocket, we can see that it has no effect on the piston or the crank shaft, and that's because the output sprocket at the moment is not connected through gears inside in the crankcase to the crank shaft here, and that corresponds with the fact that this neutral indicator here is indicating that it's in neutral. So if we were to put it in gear and turn the crank shaft, then we should, in theory, see this sprocket turning as well. Next up, we want to remove the clutch cover. So to remove the clutch cover, we have a number of bolts around its edge. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So about 11, possibly this is 12 bolts. So we need to remove these bolts, and then the cover over the clutch should just fit off. Okay. Let's turn these all counterclockwise, quarter turn at a time. None of these should be very tight. Tight. Let's get the ones at the bottom first. So again, we've got a bit of cardboard. I've knocked a number of holes to correspond with each of the bolts. I've marked it as the clutch cover, marked up and right. And that means we will not lose our bolts once we put them in the right place. This one goes in here. So do them in order. That's the best thing to do. The reason we're doing this is because the bolts can be different lengths around the edge of the clutch cover. So we want to make sure we put them back in the right order. And it also helps to not lose them. So just 2 bolts remaining at the top. Okay, and again, just be careful that your clutch cover doesn't just fall off. If you're taking the clutch cover off on the motorcycle, you don't want to fall out onto a hard surface, because again, the aluminium will crack. It's a soft metal, and it doesn't take much to pierce aluminium. I'm just holding the clutch cover while I take this last bolt off. Okay, so I don't think this one is going to fall off, because I think it's kind of held on by sealant, and the gasket, there's a little bit of, so I'm going to hit it a few light blows. So what I've done is I've taken just a little tea cloth, and there's a little protrusion here on the cover which I'm going to try and catch. So I'm sticking my finger just here. I'm taking the blunt end, the end where you really should be hitting the chisel with the hammer. I'm just sticking that in here so that it's not the spiky end of the chisel, and I'm just giving it a few taps, and that is actually freed. Just light taps. Obviously you don't want to break this off the clutch cover either, but those few taps have freed the clutch cover from the crankcase. So go back to my soft end of the mallet, just keep knocking it. Okay. So again, watching out for anything falling out. Blows here. Okay, so there we have. Should be basically free.